ballroom looked like something from a dream. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling like shining stars. Round tables were covered with white cloth and decorated with tall candles and fresh flowers. Waiters moved carefully between the guests, carrying silver trays filled with sparkling drinks. Soft music played in the background while people talked, laughed, and checked their phones. It was the biggest charity night of the year at the Grand Palace Hotel. Important business owners, social media influencers, local leaders, and reporters were all invited. Cameras flashed near the entrance as guests arrived wearing expensive dresses and sharp suits. Everyone was excited for one reason: the famous pianist who was supposed to perform that night. The main performer was known across the country. Tickets had sold out in just 2 days when his name was announced. The organizers had printed his photo on large banners near the stage. His grand piano sat in the center of the ballroom, shining under a single spotlight. It looked powerful and important, almost like it was waiting proudly for its owner. Backstage, however, the mood was very different. One of the event managers stood near the curtain with a phone pressed tightly to his ear. His face slowly lost its color. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "There's no way he can make it?" There was a long pause. The noise of the ballroom felt far away. When he finally ended the call, he just stood still for a few seconds. Another organizer walked over, worried by the look on his face. "What happened?" she asked. He swallowed hard. He canceled. His flight was delayed because of a sudden problem. "He won't arrive tonight." The words felt heavy in the air. "What do you mean canceled?" she whispered. "The program starts in less than 40 minutes. They both looked toward the stage. The beautiful piano was still there. The spotlight was still glowing. But suddenly it didn't look proud anymore. It looked empty. Panic began to spread behind the curtain. Staff members rushed around, whispering urgently. One person tried calling other musicians, but it was too late. Most performers were already booked or out of town. Some suggested playing recorded music instead. Others argued that the guests would feel cheated. The entire event was built around this performance. Out in the ballroom, the guests had no idea what was happening. They continued laughing and posing for pictures. A few walked closer to the stage, pointing at the piano and speaking excitedly about the music they were about to hear. Near the side wall, a quiet maid moved slowly with a cleaning cart. She wore a simple uniform and comfortable shoes. Her hair was tied back neatly. She kept her eyes lowered as she wiped a small mark from the marble floor. No one paid attention to her. She was just part of the background, like the flowers or the chairs. She had been working at the hotel for 3 years. Most nights were the same: cleaning after big events, polishing tables, emptying trash bins. She knew how these grand evenings worked. Important people came in shining clothes. They laughed loudly. They made promises about helping the world. And then they left, often without noticing the workers who cleaned up after them. As she pushed her cart gently along the wall, she heard 2 waiters whispering. "Did you hear?" one said. "The pianist canceled." "No way," the other replied. "That's the whole reason people came." The maid paused for a second but kept her face calm. She continued wiping the edge of a table, pretending not to listen. Backstage, the organizers were now speaking in louder voices. "This is a disaster," someone said. "The donors are here. The press is here. We can't just tell them there's no performance. We need a solution," another replied. "Anything." The event host checked his watch again and again. 10 minutes, he said nervously. "In 10 minutes, I'm supposed to introduce him." The air felt tight. It was hard to breathe. One of the younger staff members tried to make a joke. "Maybe one of us can play," he said with a weak laugh. "Or maybe the maid out there can do it." A few people chuckled quickly, but the laughter faded almost immediately. No one found it truly funny. Still, the words seemed to hang in the room. The event manager looked through the curtain toward the ballroom. His eyes landed on the maid near the wall. She was carefully adjusting a chair that had moved slightly out of line. He stared at her for a moment. There was something peaceful about the way she moved. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. Even though she had likely heard the whispers, her face stayed calm. Does anyone actually know if she can play? He asked suddenly. The others looked at him, confused. You can't be serious, someone replied. I'm serious about saving this event, he answered. We have no other options. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped out from behind the curtain and walked across the side of the ballroom toward her. Guests barely noticed him. They were too busy chatting and checking their phones. The maid saw him coming and straightened her back. Is everything okay? She asked softly. He hesitated, unsure how to begin. This might sound strange, he said carefully, but do you know how to play the piano? Her hands froze on the cleaning cloth. For a moment, she did not answer. I used to, she said quietly. A long time ago. How long ago? She looked toward the stage. The piano under the spotlight seemed very far away. Years, she replied. I haven't played on a grand piano in a very long time. He studied her face. There was no arrogance there. No excitement. Just honesty. We need someone to perform tonight, he said. The main star canceled. If we don't have music, the entire event will fall apart. Her eyes widened slightly. You want me to play? In front of all these people? I know it's sudden, he said. And I know it's not fair to ask. But we don't have anyone else. She glanced around the ballroom. The guests were dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Cameras were set up near the stage. Important faces filled the room. Her heart began to beat faster. I'm just a maid, she said gently. You're a person who can play the piano, he replied. She looked down at her hands. They were small but steady. These hands had scrubbed floors and carried heavy trash bags. They were not soft like they used to be. What if I make a mistake? She asked. He gave a tired smile. At this point, a mistake is better than silence. A few guests nearby noticed the conversation. One woman raised her eyebrow and whispered to her friend. They both looked at the maid and then at the stage, clearly confused. The maid took a slow breath. Somewhere deep inside her, a memory stirred. The feeling of sitting at a piano bench as a child, her feet barely touching the ground. The sound of keys under her fingers. The way music once filled her small home with light. But that was another life. She had not planned to return to it tonight. The event host's voice suddenly echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The performance will begin shortly. The manager looked at her again. Please, he said softly. Just try. She closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, something had changed. Give me 5 minutes, she said. He nodded quickly. As he hurried back behind the curtain, whispers began to move through the crowd. Guests noticed the maid standing near the stage. Some pointed quietly. A few even laughed, thinking it must be some kind of joke. She stood there alone for a moment, holding her cleaning cloth. Then she slowly placed it back into her cart. The spotlight continued shining on the grand piano, waiting, and for the first time in years she walked toward it. The whispering grew louder as she stood near the edge of the stage. Guests had started noticing that something unusual was happening. The famous pianist they had been waiting for was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a hotel maid in a simple uniform was standing too close to the spotlight. At one of the front tables, a man in a dark suit leaned toward his wife and said, "This must be part of the program. Maybe some kind of joke before the real performance." His wife gave a small laugh. "I hope so. We didn't donate all that money to watch hotel staff perform." Their words were not meant to be loud, but they were loud enough. The maid heard them. She kept her eyes forward and her face calm, but inside, her chest felt tight. She had faced many small insults before. People often spoke as if she were invisible. But this moment felt different. This time all eyes were on her. Behind the curtain, the organizers were moving quickly. One of them handed her a small microphone. "You don't have to speak much," he whispered. "Just play. We will explain that the main performer had a travel emergency. We will say that tonight, the hotel is proud to present a special surprise." She nodded slowly, even though her hands felt cold. A hotel staff member quickly brought her a small glass of water. She took a sip but could barely swallow. Her heart was beating so loudly that she wondered if others could hear it. The event host walked to the center of the stage. The lights dimmed slightly. Conversations faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but serious. "We have received unexpected news this evening. Due to a sudden travel issue, our scheduled pianist is unable to join us." A wave of disappointment moved through the room. Some guests sighed. Others shook their heads. "But," he continued quickly, "sometimes life surprises us in ways we do not expect. Tonight, we would like to present someone very special. Talent does not always stand under bright lights. Sometimes it works quietly behind the scenes." A few people looked confused. The host turned slightly and gestured toward her. "Please welcome." He paused for half a second, realizing he did not even know how to introduce her properly. She was not famous. She did not have a stage name. He simply said, "Please welcome one of our own." Soft, uncertain claps filled the room. She felt her feet move before her mind could stop them. Each step toward the piano felt heavy and light at the same time. The spotlight followed her, making her simple uniform look even more plain against the golden stage. Someone in the back let out a quiet chuckle. Another person whispered, "This should be interesting." She reached the piano bench and stood still for a moment. The grand piano looked larger than she remembered. Its black surface shone like a mirror. She could see her reflection faintly in it. Not the young girl she once was, but the woman she had become. Her fingers hovered over the keys but did not touch them yet. Her mind was racing. She thought about turning around. She thought about saying she had changed her mind. No one would blame her. She was not the one who caused the problem tonight. But then she remembered something else. She remembered the first time she had ever touched a piano. It had been old and slightly out of tune. It stood in the corner of a small community center. She had been nervous then too. Her hands had shaken just like this. And yet, once she played the first note, everything had felt right. The ballroom was completely silent now. Even the people who had been laughing were waiting to see what would happen. She slowly sat down on the bench. The bench felt different from the ones she used to practice on. It was softer, more expensive. But the keys were the same, black and white, simple and honest. She gently placed her fingers on them. For a moment, she did nothing. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Some guests shifted in their chairs. A few looked at their watches. Behind the curtain, the event manager held his breath. Then, finally, a single note filled the room. It was soft, almost like a whisper. A few people leaned forward slightly. Another note followed. Then another. She began with something simple, something safe. A slow melody that felt like a quiet conversation. Her hands were still slightly stiff, but they remembered more than she expected. The sound of the piano was clear and warm. It traveled through the ballroom, touching every corner. The whispers stopped. The people who had been smirking were no longer smiling. She closed her eyes for a brief second and let her fingers move more freely. The melody grew deeper, richer. It was no longer careful. It was honest. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. She was no longer thinking about the expensive dresses or the judging eyes. She was thinking about the music. At one of the back tables, a young waiter stopped walking and simply stood still, listening. Near the front, the same woman who had laughed earlier slowly lowered her glass. Her expression changed from amusement to surprise. The notes began to connect in a way that felt powerful. There was sadness in them, but also strength. It was not the kind of music that showed off speed or noise. It was the kind that told a story. She let her hands move across the keys with more confidence now. The piano responded beautifully, as if it had been waiting for someone who truly understood it. The room felt different. The air felt softer. Even the reporters near the stage stopped checking their cameras and simply watched. As she played, small memories rose inside her. Long evenings of practice. The sound of encouragement from someone who once believed in her deeply. The feeling of dreaming about big stages. For years, she had locked those memories away. Life had become about survival, not dreams. She had convinced herself that music belonged to her past. But in this moment, sitting under the spotlight, she realized that music had never left her. It had only been quiet. Her fingers moved faster now, but not wildly. Each note had meaning. Each pause had purpose. The melody began to rise, building gently like a wave. Guests who had expected a disaster were now sitting very still. Some had their hands folded tightly in their laps. Others leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single sound. Behind the curtain, one of the organizers wiped away a tear without understanding why. She did not see any of this. She was lost in the piano. For the first time in many years, she did not feel small. She did not feel invisible. She felt like herself. The music grew stronger, filling the large ballroom completely. It no longer mattered that she was wearing a maid's uniform. It no longer mattered that she had been cleaning floors just minutes earlier. In that moment, she was not background. She was the center. And as the melody reached a gentle peak, something inside the room shifted. Respect replaced doubt. Curiosity replaced mockery. The same people who had pointed at her were now watching with wide eyes. Her hands continued to move with quiet power, guiding the audience deeper into the story she was telling without words. The night that had almost fallen apart was slowly becoming something no one would ever forget. The music did not stop after the first wave of surprise. Instead, it grew deeper. Her fingers were no longer careful. They were certain. The simple melody she began with slowly changed into something fuller, something alive. Felt like she was opening a door that had been locked for years. The ballroom was completely silent now. Even the sound of glasses touching plates had disappeared. The waiters stood still near the walls. The photographers forgot to press their camera buttons. It was as if time had paused. At the front table, the same man who had joked earlier slowly leaned back in his chair. His eyes were fixed on her hands. He could not understand how someone dressed in a simple uniform could play with such control and emotion. She felt the change in the room without looking at anyone. Music has a way of speaking when words are not enough. And tonight, her playing was saying everything she had kept inside for years. Her left hand moved smoothly across the lower keys, creating a soft, steady rhythm. Her right hand danced gently over the higher notes, adding light and color. The sound echoed beautifully under the crystal lights above. The grand piano responded to her touch as if it recognized her. Each key pressed down with strength and grace. There was no fear left in her movements, but inside her heart, memories were rising. She remembered the small apartment where she grew up. It had thin walls and old furniture. In the corner of the living room stood a second-hand piano. It was scratched and slightly worn, but to her, it had been the most beautiful thing in the world. She remembered practicing late at night while others in the building slept. She remembered someone sitting quietly nearby, listening with pride and hope. Back then, she believed music would carry her somewhere far from struggle. Life had other plans. As she continued playing, the melody slowly changed again. It became stronger, almost bold. It was no longer only soft and emotional. Now it carried determination. A young woman sitting near the middle of the room felt tears gather in her eyes. She did not know why. She did not know this performer. But something about the music felt personal. Across the room, an older man closed his eyes. The sound reminded him of years he had forgotten, of dreams he once had but never followed. The event host stood near the side of the stage, completely still. He had introduced hundreds of performers in his career, but he had never seen a room change so quickly. The maid who had been invisible just 30 minutes ago was now holding everyone's attention without saying a single word. Her back straightened slightly as she moved into a more complex part of the piece. Her fingers traveled quickly across the keys, but not wildly. Each note landed exactly where it needed to be. There was confidence in her touch now. Some guests glanced at each other with wide eyes, silently asking the same question. Who is she? Near the entrance, one of the hotel's senior managers had just arrived after handling the travel issue of the canceled performer. He stepped inside quietly, expecting disappointment and frustration. Instead, he heard music. He froze. He had attended many concerts before. He had heard professionals, award winners, and famous names. But this felt different. This felt real. He walked slowly toward the ballroom, following the sound. On stage, she allowed the melody to slow down again. The louder, stronger part gently faded into something softer. It was like the calm after a storm. Her breathing was steady now. Her hands were warm. She was no longer thinking about the crowd. She was thinking about the piano. For years, she had passed by this very ballroom while cleaning after events. She had often looked at the grand piano from a distance, wondering how it would feel to play it. But she never allowed herself to dream too long. Dreams felt dangerous when responsibilities were heavy. And yet, here she was, not as a guest, not as a hired star, but as herself. The melody turned gentle and reflective. It sounded like forgiveness, like letting go. In the audience, the woman who had laughed earlier slowly placed her hand over her heart. Her eyes were shining now. She felt ashamed of her earlier words. A young reporter near the stage began recording quietly on her phone, careful not to disturb the silence. The music continued to flow like a story unfolding chapter by chapter. Every pause between notes felt meaningful. Every rise and fall carried emotion. She allowed one final build of sound to grow. It was not loud in a showy way. It was powerful in a quiet way. The kind of power that comes from truth. Her fingers moved quickly for a few breathtaking seconds, then slowed, slower, softer, until only a few gentle notes remained. The final note lingered in the air, and then it faded. She kept her hands resting lightly on the keys for a moment longer. She did not rush to stand up. She simply sat there, feeling the silence that followed. The ballroom remained completely quiet. No one moved. It was not the uncomfortable silence from earlier. It was a full silence, the kind that happens when people are deeply touched and do not know how to respond right away. Her heart was beating fast again, but for a different reason now. Slowly, she lifted her hands from the piano. The first clap came from somewhere near the back of the room. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom exploded into applause. People stood up from their chairs. The sound of clapping filled the space with energy. Some guests even wiped their eyes as they applauded. She looked up, surprised. For a moment, she could not believe that the applause was for her. The event host stepped forward, smiling widely now. The relief on his face was clear. The disaster that had threatened the night had turned into something unforgettable. She slowly stood from the bench. The spotlight still shone on her, but it no longer felt harsh. Felt warm. She gave a small, humble nod toward the audience. The applause continued. Behind the curtain, staff members were hugging each other in disbelief. One of them whispered, "We almost missed this." In the front row, the senior manager who had just arrived felt something he had not felt in years, admiration without doubt. He turned to one of the organizers and asked quietly, "Who trained her?" The organizer shook his head. "We don't know." On stage, she stepped back slightly from the piano, unsure of what to do next. She had come forward only to help. She had not expected this reaction. The applause slowly softened, but it did not completely stop. Someone called out, "Encore!" A few others repeated it. She felt a small, shy smile touch her face. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to look directly at the crowd. The same faces that had doubted her were now filled with respect. And in that moment, she understood something important. She had not just saved the event. She had reminded herself who she truly was. The night was no longer about the cancelled star. It was about the woman who had once been invisible, and was invisible no more. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled through the ballroom again and again, like waves hitting the shore. She stood there, feeling almost frozen. Just an hour ago, she had been wiping tables and adjusting chairs. Now hundreds of people were standing for her. She did not know where to look. The event host stepped closer and gently leaned toward her. "They're asking for another piece," he whispered with a warm smile. She hesitated. Her heart was still racing from the first performance. Playing once had already felt like stepping into deep water. Playing again felt even bigger. But when she looked at the piano, something inside her softened. She nodded quietly. The crowd noticed the small movement and began clapping again. She returned to the bench, smoothing her uniform slightly before sitting down. This time, her hands did not tremble. She placed her fingers on the keys and began a different melody. This one was more personal. Started gently, almost like a lullaby. The sound carried a warmth that felt like home. As she played, memories came back clearly now, not blurry like before. She saw her childhood again. Her home had never been big or fancy. The paint on the walls had faded. The sofa had a small tear on one side. But there had always been music in that space. The old piano had been placed near the window. In the afternoon, sunlight would fall across the keys, making them shine softly. She used to sit there for hours, practicing scales, repeating small mistakes again and again until she got them right. There had been someone who believed in her deeply. Someone who saved money slowly, coin by coin, to pay for lessons. That person used to sit quietly nearby, listening after long days of hard work. There were no big speeches, just quiet pride. She had once been told that her talent was special, that she could go far if she kept going. And she had believed it. But life had shifted suddenly. The one who believed in her became sick. Hospital visits replaced piano lessons. Bills replaced sheet music. The sound of practice slowly turned into silence. She remembered the day she stopped playing regularly. It had not been dramatic. There had been no announcement. She had simply closed the piano lid one evening and did not open it again for a long time. Responsibilities had come first. She had found work wherever she could. Cleaning rooms, washing dishes, later working at the hotel. Music became something she carried quietly inside instead of something she showed to the world. As these memories moved through her mind, her hands expressed them through the keys. The melody grew deeper. There was sadness in it now, but not bitterness. It sounded like someone who had accepted hard days but never stopped feeling. In the audience, people felt the change. They could sense that this piece was not just performance. It was personal. At one of the front tables, the man who had earlier doubted her lowered his head slightly. He thought about how easily he had judged her by her uniform. Near the side wall, the other hotel staff watched with shining eyes. They knew her as the quiet worker who always helped others without complaint. They had never known about this part of her life. The senior manager stood with his arms crossed, listening carefully. He was not thinking about business now. He was thinking about how easily true talent can be overlooked. On stage, her back was straight, but her face was soft. She was no longer afraid of the spotlight. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply telling her story the only way she knew how. The music slowly became stronger again. Not loud, but powerful in emotion. It felt like hope rising after a long night. Her fingers moved confidently over the keys, showing skill that could not be learned overnight. This was years of practice hidden behind years of silence. Some guests began recording again, but this time carefully and respectfully. A young music teacher sitting near the middle of the room leaned toward her friend and whispered, "She is real training. You can hear it in her control." Her friend nodded without speaking, eyes still fixed on the stage. The melody built toward a gentle peak. It felt like standing at the top of a hill after a long climb. There was no anger in it, only strength. Then slowly, she let the sound soften again. The final notes of the second piece floated lightly into the air, like a quiet thank you. When the last key was pressed, she lifted her hands and allowed the silence to settle naturally. This time, the applause came even faster. It was louder than before. People stood again, some clapping above their heads. A few wiped tears openly now. There was no laughter anywhere in the room. The host stepped forward, visibly moved. "That," he said softly into the microphone, "is what tonight was truly meant to be about." He turned to her. "Would you share your name with us?" She paused. For years, she had introduced herself only as staff, only as someone who worked behind the scenes. Now, under the bright lights, she spoke her name clearly into the microphone. It echoed through the ballroom. and for the first time in a long time it felt important. The crowd repeated it softly in applause. The senior manager stepped closer to the stage once the clapping eased. He leaned toward the host and said quietly, "After the program ends, I want to speak with her." She stepped away from the piano slowly, unsure of what would happen next. As she walked toward the side of the stage, several guests reached out gently to shake her hand. Their faces carried respect now, not amusement. One woman said softly, "Thank you. That was beautiful." Another added, "You reminded me of something I forgot." She responded with small, humble smiles. Back near the curtain, the event manager looked at her with relief and gratitude. "You didn't just save the night," he said quietly. "You made it unforgettable." She shook her head slightly. "I just played," she replied. But deep inside, she knew it was more than that. She had opened a part of herself she thought was closed forever. And the world had listened. As the rest of the evening continued with speeches and dinner, the energy in the room felt different. People spoke more softly. They seemed more thoughtful. The cancelled star was no longer the focus. Instead, whispers moved from table to table about the maid who played like a professional. Some guests searched her name online but found nothing. No recordings. No interviews. Just a simple worker who had stepped into light for one unexpected night. She stood quietly near the side wall again later, but something had changed. She was still wearing the same uniform. She was still the same person. But now, when people looked at her, they truly saw her. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice that had once gone silent began to speak again. The rest of the evening moved forward, but nothing felt the same as before. Guests still enjoyed their dinner. Speeches were given. Awards were handed out. But every conversation somehow returned to one topic. The maid. The piano. That performance. Phones buzzed at nearly every table. Short clips of her playing were already being shared. Some guests had recorded the first piece. Others had captured the second one. Within minutes, those videos began traveling far beyond the ballroom. She did not know any of this. After stepping away from the stage, she quietly returned to the staff area. She leaned against the wall for a moment and took a long breath. Her legs felt weak now that the pressure was gone. One of the waiters approached her slowly. "I didn't know you could play like that," he said, almost in disbelief. She gave a small smile. "I didn't know either," she replied honestly. Another staff member hugged her tightly. "You made all of us proud tonight," she whispered. Those words touched her more deeply than the applause. For years, she had worked beside these people. They had seen her tired, stressed, and quiet. Now they were looking at her with admiration. She felt shy but also warm inside. A knock came at the staff room door. The event manager stepped in. "The senior manager would like to speak with you," he said gently. Her stomach tightened again. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Maybe she had broken some rule by stepping onto the stage. She followed him back toward the ballroom. The crowd was thinner now. Some guests were preparing to leave, but many were still talking excitedly near the stage. The senior manager stood waiting near the piano. His expression was calm, but serious. "You surprised all of us tonight," he said. "I'm sorry if I caused any trouble," she answered quickly. He shook his head. "You caused the opposite of trouble." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She explained simply. Years of lessons as a child. Long hours of practice. Then life-changing direction. He listened carefully, not interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Talent like that does not disappear," he said. "It only waits." She did not know what to say to that. Before the conversation could continue, a well-dressed woman approached them. She introduced herself as someone who organized local cultural events. "I have never heard such honest playing," the woman said warmly. "Would you consider performing at a small community concert next month?" The question felt unreal. She glanced at the manager, unsure if she was even allowed to accept such an offer. He smiled slightly. "This conversation is yours," he said. More people began approaching. A music teacher offered free practice space if she needed it. A small business owner offered to sponsor her lessons if she wanted to study again. A reporter asked if she would agree to a short interview about her story. She felt overwhelmed. Just hours ago, she had been invisible in the corner of the room. Now people were asking for her time. Across the ballroom, the woman who had once laughed stood quietly watching. After a moment of hesitation, she walked forward. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "I judged you without knowing you." The words were simple but sincere. She nodded gently. "It's okay," she replied, and she truly meant it. Holding anger would only make her heart heavier. Near the entrance, guests continued sharing videos online. Comments began appearing under the clips. "Who is she? Why haven't we heard of her before? This is real talent." By the time the final guests left the hotel, the videos had already reached thousands of views. Late that night, after changing out of her uniform, she stepped outside the hotel for fresh air. The city lights flickered in the distance. Cars passed quietly on the road. Everything looked normal, but inside her nothing felt the same. She thought about the applause. She thought about the offers. She thought about the piano. For years, she had told herself that chapter of her life was closed. It had felt safer that way. Safer not to hope. Safer not to dream too big. But tonight had shaken something awake. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from one of the staff members. A link to a video. She clicked it. There she was on screen, sitting at the grand piano under the bright lights. The sound of her own playing filled her ears again. She watched in silence. Below the video, comments were appearing every second. "She gave me chills. This is why we should never judge. Please tell us her name." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry loudly. The tears were quiet, like relief. The next morning, things moved even faster. When she arrived at work, several staff members were already talking about her. The hotel lobby television was playing a short news clip about the event. A reporter described how an unexpected performer had saved the night. Guests who had stayed overnight asked to meet her before checking out. She felt shy walking through the lobby. The senior manager called her into his office later that day. "We have received several calls asking about you," he said calmly. "Some want interviews. Others want performances." She sat quietly, listening. "We support you," he continued. "If you wish to explore this opportunity, we will adjust your schedule. You have given this hotel something special. We want to see you grow." She could hardly believe the words. For so long, she had worked simply to survive. Now she was being encouraged to rise. During her lunch break, she walked past the ballroom again. It was empty now. The decorations were gone. Chairs were stacked neatly to the side. But the grand piano remained in its place. She stepped inside slowly. The room was quiet. She approached the piano and gently lifted the lid. Her fingers touched the keys softly, not to perform, but to remember. This time she did not feel fear. She felt possibility. Behind her, she heard light footsteps. It was the event manager. "You're trending online," he said with a smile. She laughed nervously. "I don't even understand how that works." He shrugged. "All I know is that people are inspired." She looked at the piano again. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine something different for her future. Not just cleaning after events. Not just watching from the side. But sitting at the center. The night that began with panic had opened a door she thought was locked forever. And as she pressed one gentle note into the quiet ballroom, she understood something clearly. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something she had almost forgotten to hope for. The days after the event felt unreal. Her phone, which had once stayed mostly silent except for work messages, now buzzed constantly. Notifications appeared every few minutes. New followers, new comments, invitations, encouraging words from strangers she had never met. At first, she felt nervous even opening the messages. She was not used to attention. For years, her life had been simple and quiet. Work, home, responsibility, sleep, repeat. Now people were calling her inspiring. The The small video clips from that night continued spreading online. Someone had edited different angles together. Another person had added soft subtitles with her name. One post described her as the maid who became the star. She did not know how to feel about that title. She had never wanted to become a star. She had only wanted to help. One afternoon, she received a call from the woman who had invited her to the community concert. The date was confirmed. A small local theater. A simple stage. Nothing fancy. But this time, her name would be printed on the poster. When she heard that, she had to sit down. Her name, on a poster, felt almost too big to believe. The hotel management kept their promise. They adjusted her schedule so she could practice in the ballroom during quiet hours. Early mornings before guests arrived. Late evenings after events ended. Each time she sat at the grand piano, she felt more confident. Her fingers were becoming stronger again. The stiffness was fading. Old skills were returning like friends who had simply been waiting for her to call them back. Sometimes other staff members would quietly sit at the back of the empty ballroom and listen while she practiced. They never interrupted. They just smiled proudly. One evening, the senior manager entered during her practice. He did not speak at first. He simply stood and listened until she finished. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when the main performer canceled, we thought the night was ruined." She smiled gently. "So did I." He shook his head. "It wasn't ruined. It was redirected." Those words stayed with her. Redirected. Maybe that is what life had done to her years ago. It had redirected her path, not ended it. The day of the community concert arrived sooner than she expected. The theater was much smaller than the hotel ballroom. The seats were simple. The stage lights were not as bright, but her heart beat just as fast. Backstage, she stood quietly, holding the edge of the curtain. She could hear people talking on the other side. Families, students, older couples. No luxury gowns. No expensive suits. Just ordinary people. She preferred it that way. When her name was announced, the applause felt warm and welcoming. She walked to the piano with steady steps. This time no one laughed. No one whispered. They were there because they wanted to hear her. She began playing. The first piece was gentle, full of gratitude. The second was stronger, filled with hope. She added a new composition she had written herself during late-night practice sessions. It carried her journey within it. Struggle, silence, courage, and light. When she finished, the audience stood to their feet. She saw children clapping excitedly. She saw older listeners wiping tears. She saw faces filled with encouragement. After the concert, several young girls approached her shyly. One of them said, "I want to learn piano, but my parents say it's not practical." She knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "If you love it, keep learning," she said softly. "Life may slow you down, but don't let it silence you." She realized then that her story was no longer only about her. It was about possibility. Over the next few months, more invitations came. Small stages at first, then larger ones. She did not rush. She accepted only what felt right. She continued working part-time at the hotel for a while, not because she had to, but because she respected the place that had given her unexpected courage. Eventually, a well-known music academy offered her a scholarship to complete advanced training. They had seen her videos. They believed in her potential. When she read the acceptance letter, her hands trembled. Years ago, she had thought that door was closed forever. Now it stood open. The hotel organized a small farewell gathering when she decided to focus fully on music. It was not a luxury event. Just staff members, simple decorations, and honest smiles. The senior manager spoke briefly. "We once hired her to clean our halls," he said warmly. "Tonight, we celebrate her for filling them with music." Everyone applauded. She thanked them with tears in her eyes. "I was always more than my uniform," she said quietly. "But I needed that night to remember it." Years later, when people told the story of that charity event, they no longer focused on the canceled star. They spoke about the maid who stepped forward when no one expected her to. They spoke about the lesson learned in that ballroom, that talent does not depend on titles, clothing, or social status. It depends on courage. She eventually performed on larger stages, but she never forgot that first spotlight. The one that felt frightening at first. The one that revealed who she truly was. Whenever she was asked in interviews about her big break, she would smile and say, "It wasn't a break, it was a chance. And I almost said no." She continued visiting schools and community centers, encouraging young people not to hide their gifts just because life becomes difficult. And sometimes, when she returned to the Grand Palace Hotel for special events, she would walk through the same ballroom where everything changed. The crystal lights would still shine. The tables would still be decorated. But now, when she stepped inside, she did not feel small. She would sit at the grand piano confidently, not as a replacement, not as a surprise, but as the featured performer. And each time her fingers touched the keys, she remembered the night when laughter turned into silence. Not a silence of doubt, but a silence of respect. The night the main star canceled, and the woman in the simple uniform became unforgettable.